You're live now.
Good evening. At this time, we'll call to order the Board of County Commissioners meeting for Monday, July 30, for the purpose of a public hearing and to receive public input on the proposed 2019 budget. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Schaefer.
Here.
Commissioner Allen.
Here.
Commissioner Klicka.
Here.
Commissioner Osterhaus.
Here.
Commissioner Ashcraft.
Here.
Commissioner Brown.
Here.
And Chairman Eilert.
Here. All commissioners are present. Would you join with me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. For those who are present, if you have a noise-making device, would ask that you turn it to silent mode or off so as not to interfere with our electronic communications. Proceedings this evening will be streamed, and would hope that myself included can be on silent or off mode. We do have two sign language interpreters with us this evening, Allison and Amanda. Our streaming will have closed caption. Is there anyone present who would enjoy the services of sign interpreters? If you would just raise your hand. If there's no one present, then Allison and Amanda, you are excused. Thank you for being here this evening and being willing to help us out for those who might have needed the service. Thank you very much. Our meeting this evening is a little different from our regular meetings. And just a very brief outline. Tonight's meeting, there will be no decisions made. It will but to receive public input. The schedule calls for staff to review Thursday at our regular meeting the input that we received this evening. And then on August 9th, at our regular meeting, Thursday meeting, we will make final decisions about the county's 2019 budget. So that is the process. Again, there will be no action taken this evening. We will start with presentation by Scott Neufeld, who's director of our budget office. There will be time if commissioners have questions about the information that's presented. And then we will open the podium to receive public comment. The procedure will follow with that. As you come to the podium, state your name and address and limit your comments to 3 minutes. The clerk will, you might hold up the sign, advise you when there's a minute left, and then when the 3 minutes are out. I would also say this, depending upon the number of comments we have and the hour of the evening, if we finish the comment and there's someone who needs to add an additional 3 minutes, we will also receive that information. So at this time, Mr. Neufeld, you have a presentation to make.
Thank you. Scott Neufeld with the Budget Office. The 2019 budget as proposed stands at $1.1 billion. That's $819 million in actual expenditures and $281 million in reserves, which means the county's not actually planning on spending those dollars. There's a little over 4,000 FTEs in the proposed budget. That's up 58 from last year. The CIP totals $99 million, and the assessed valuation for next year is $10.5 billion, and that's up 7% from last year. This next slide breaks out the categories of the county budget. As you can see, the county general services expenditure budget is the largest. That's at just under $400 million. The reserves, which I talked about and we'll go into further detail in a minute, are at $281 million. And wastewater, both operating and capital, is at $158 million. This is that breakout of reserves I was talking about, and the important thing to note here is that the county general fund is the one that's really the backstop for the county and where the board has the most say and the most prerogative, and that's at $88.4 million. Other county tax-supported items that are 106, and as you can see, the remainder, which fall out of the county taxing district, account for the remainder, well over 50% there. Some of the highlights of the 2019 budget is that our taxes, ad valorem taxes, are 32.7% of our revenue. That's our largest source. That's about $265 million next year. The mill levy is proposed at 26.351 mills. Although the board has proposed a quarter mill rollback, that's where we intend to go, but we wanted to get through the state budget cycle before we committed to that. We did a rollback last year as well of about 0.25 mills. The average resident pays $78 a month in property taxes, and the increased valuation between 2018 and 2019, you can see there went up about 6.5% on existing, or the average, so that's about $4.80 a month. And lastly, we are a AAA county, which means that we have AAA credit ratings from the three major bond credit rating agencies. In terms of next year's strategic priorities and how they line up with the budget, we have four major capital things going on. We have the courthouse, which is slated to go up across the street, and the medical examiner's facility, which is down at 119th and Ridgeview. That's one project, a funding source of a 1/4-cent sales tax the voters approved. We're expanding the Tomahawk wastewater plant over close to state line. The library has a master plan that's underway. Monticello Library is opening up this weekend, I believe, so that's really exciting. And the Park and Rec Legacy Plan has a host of things included, and those have been going on for about 3 years. We also have some FTEs committed to improving our data, our safety of our data, and integrating our systems. We're taking a hard look at transit routes this year and doing a heavy-duty analysis. And then lastly, we've put a lot of commitment towards mental health for JCDS and human services in that area. These are the budget principles that are interesting to the people in my office and almost nobody else. We actually do maintain these. This is part of how we get our AAA rating, but we try to maintain sufficient general fund reserves. The rating agencies look at that, so that's very important. We match ongoing revenue with ongoing revenue sources, so we don't have shortfalls, and we also stay conservative to avoid shortfalls. This is the property tax distribution in Johnson County. So this is county taxpayers, but everything that their property tax goes for. So one of the great joys that Tom Franzen, the county treasurer, has is to send out tax bills and collect all this revenue, but it's not all levied by the county. So as you can see, the schools are the largest portion of property tax. And while property tax is the county's primary funding source, you can see that there's two components on schools. One is a mill levy. It's 20 mills. It says it's a school mill levy. That's actually the state funding that gets sent to Topeka, and then the local portion is at 41%. So when you look at your tax bill, you'll see two different breakouts there, and there's usually a capital portion and operating on your local schools, and then the state piece. The county budget includes parks and libraries, so that's about 20% in total on the green. The cities and townships are at 16%. But the big thing that Tom always likes me to point out is although we send out the bills, we're not spending all that money. The sales tax revenue paints a similar story, and this is a little different in terms of obviously when you shop, the county doesn't collect that, but eventually 10% does come back to the county. 70% goes to the state, 18% for the cities, and then the small sliver there is the Research Triangle. And that is a tax that was passed in 2008 specifically for that effort. That money comes to the county from the state, and then we send it immediately, same day, to the Research Triangle. This next one has way too many slices on it, but it really shows different types of revenues, and we talked about ad valorem, and so we've got this broken out across taxing districts here. And as you can see, at the bottom there is the county, but the library and park and rec are separate taxing districts, but they run through the county's budget, so that's about 32% altogether. You can see that wastewater has capital and user charges broken out, but that's about 15% altogether. We've got 17% as sales and a few other taxes, and then charges for services also pretty significant at about 12%. This is our CIP. It's similarly broken out by different categories. Right now, wastewater is the largest at 40%. Infrastructure includes roads out in the unincorporated area. It also includes the CARS program. That's a joint effort between the counties and the cities. Uses gas tax and some county taxing dollars, so shared funding of projects throughout the county. And if you see those signs, that's what that's for. Wastewater is similarly something that the county collects via sales tax, but most of those projects end up in the incorporated areas, and that's a great program because watersheds don't really follow city lines too well, so that's been a very successful program. The county's total mill levy is shown next. You can see that the mill levy was increased in 2016. That was for three primary reasons. One was to offset mortgage registration, and the other was to start up those strategic plans for parks and library. We've held it steady since then. We did about a $0.25 mill rollback last year, and we intend to do another $0.25 mill this year. This next one is the history by taxing district, and we talked about that. They're separate entries, but also we have some statewide data by the county or the general taxing district that kind of puts into perspective the county's taxing effort across the state. So that's why we have that slide here. And this is a representation of the mill levies of the 5 lowest counties besides Johnson County. You can see from this that this is county taxing districts only. That's why we had that first slide. And we're 51% below Pottawatomie County, which has the second lowest mill levy. And as you look through that list, you can see that there's Sedgwick in there, which is one of the larger counties, but we're significantly below all these counties. And the next one is the comparative on the 5 largest counties. Johnson County is the largest county in the state. It's also the largest county in Johnson County, I suppose. But one thing that's key is Sedgwick is over 500,000, and then it drops down significantly after there. So they're the most comparable to us, and we're 50% below them, and you can see quite a bit further ahead on the other counties. This next one is a pretty complex chart, but it's really, in my mind, really shows the value because if you look at the household income, Johnson County has the highest. We also have the highest median value owner-occupied homes. And so this is really an affordability index. We've been doing this for a number of years, but what it really tries to get to is median value, median income against the mill levy rate to get a tax, and then so what's the taxing burden is. You can see even when you take into account that our mills are worth more, we have higher valuation, you can see that we're still value-based as a percentage of income by far the lowest. We're over 25% lower than Sedgwick, so that's pretty significant, and that's a slide that, in my mind, is one of the better apples-to-apples comparisons on value. This next slide is a representation of the mill levy, just graphically of those other counties, and just shows how much below them Johnson County is. This other one is another math exercise. There are a number of outside entities that like to look at CPI and population growth as the only drivers why someone might bring in more mill levy. And so we've been running this for a number of years, and what it shows in the top line, the black line, is if the county, going back to the start of the recession, had just indexed the mill levy for those two factors throughout time. Now what happened is during the recession is the assessed valuation went down, and we held the line on the mill levy, so our revenues actually went down. And that's why our ad valorem, or the red line, actually goes down in those first years of the recession and doesn't really start going back up until 2014, 2015. What this really captures is if we had gone ahead and levied during the recession, and again, that's when people were worried about holding on to their houses. It was kind of a scary time, and we made the right decision to do that. But we would have levied cumulatively over $200 million more. Some of the most conservative groups out there say that this is how you should figure out your mill levy, and this is something I'm also very proud of, because in these 11 years, 12 budgets, we are over $200 million below that marker. You can see that we've been catching up in recent years. Part of that is because the mortgage registration was removed by the state. That was a $15–20 million revenue source that they phased out over 5 years. But still, even with that included, we are under that marker, and that's very important and something that I personally am very proud of. This next one is just address and telephone numbers. We're about to take public comment, but if something comes to you or a follow-up question, these are the numbers that you can call. If it's a detail, numbers geek kind of question, call my office. If it's a kind of larger operations one, feel free to call the county manager. And if it's more political in nature, feel free to call the board. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the chairman.
Well, Scott does, and his crew in the budget office do some great work for us, but this work starts back in January and February of each year. The county manager's office, together with department directors, begin planning and working on the next year's budget, which in this case was 2019. And by April and May time frame, they have a recommendation. The county manager is required by the county charter to make recommendations on the budget, both the operating as well as capital expenditures budget. And so what we have this evening is a compilation of all of that work. And in May, that information was presented to the Board of County Commissioners for discussion and made the recommendation on the budget that we have here this evening. So it's not a 30-day project. It's more like a six-month plus project. And we are required to submit our budget to the state of Kansas by mid-August, I believe it is. I should also mention one other factor. We do not know what our final assessed valuation numbers will be until sometime in October. So whatever mill levy is talked about or discussed, we think we have a pretty good projection, but that mill levy could vary because we have to submit a budget prior to knowing exactly what the assessed valuation is going to be. We've tried to get that changed at the state level, but so far the legislature has not been receptive to any changes in that process. I have a couple of questions or a couple of notes. Scott, if you'll go back to slide number 3, it shows the various spending categories. And I just want to mention wastewater, which is listed there, I think, at about $158 million of our budget. Wastewater does not receive any tax resources. Wastewater does not serve the entire county. Parts of Olathe, DeSoto, Gardner, Edgerton, and Spring Hill have their own wastewater services. So Johnson County Wastewater was formed as a utility, and only the patrons of that utility, those who receive service from Johnson County Wastewater, support Johnson County Wastewater. So just a note, there are no tax dollars that support Johnson County Wastewater. And then if you'll go to the next slide, number 4, on the reserves, you'll note that wastewater at $134 million in reserves is one of the largest reserve categories in our reserve budget. The reason for that, over the past few years, we've been building that reserve because of action that's ongoing right now. The Tomahawk Creek wastewater plant, which is located at Mission Road and 435, and it's about 55, 60 years old. About 50% of the flow to that plant goes on to Kansas City, Missouri for treatment, and that's the way it's been for decades. Because of the fact that Kansas City, Missouri was under an EPA edict, and their rates are going to go up, it was determined that in about 2 or 3 years, it would be less expensive for our ratepayers if we would rebuild that plant and start servicing the entire flow rather than spending additional higher rates for Kansas City, Missouri to treat it. So that rebuilding is underway, and it's about a 2.5 or 3 year project. So during that time, the flow, all of our flow will go to Kansas City, Missouri for treatment. And that means that our payment to Kansas City, Missouri will increase. We will use part of those reserves that we've built up in order to offset that higher cost. So that's the reason for that high number. Scott, I have one other question. Obviously, the 2019 budget, the revenues will be based on the appraisals that were made in the first 6 months of 2018. And some of those appraisals on the properties were up 15, 20% or more. We have made provisions to reduce the mill levy. General fund, at the May meeting, we had discussions about modest reductions in the mill levy for parks and libraries. And I want to make sure that there's a clear understanding of the revenues involved there. All of our budgets are planned and projected on 5% budget increases. Because of the increase in assessed valuation, property tax revenues are going to go up about 6.7%, 6.6%. And Scott, I know you have the numbers for the general fund over our 5% projection. What is that number?
Thank you, Chairman. The valuation increase is 7.25%. However, with a quarter mill rollback, we'll be under 6 at approximately 5.85%. And so what that means is that that differential will be due to that modest rollback that you mentioned. So if we had held the mill levy constant, it would have gone up 7.25. With the adjustment, we'll be closer to 5.85. And again, that's an estimate until October.
Well, again, I want the number, the dollar amount.
Oh, I'm sorry. The ad valorem is scheduled to go from 186.5 to 200, which is 13.5 million. However, when we roll back, that'll take it to 197.4. So that's a decrease of $2.5 or $2.6 million.
So the net in increase in revenue
is a little less than 11. It's about 10.8 million.
Okay. And need the same number for parks.
All right. Parks is currently scheduled to go up by about 2.2 million. And we had contemplated rolling back about a little over 200,000. And so that would take that increase from almost 2 million to 2.2 million down to 1.95 million, 1.96 million.
And again, that's above the 5% projection.
The differential would be still above 5%. They'd still be at 6.5%.
All right. And the library, the number for the library is?
The library is currently scheduled to go from 31.1 to 33.3. So that is about a 2.1 million increase. We're talking about reducing that by about 150,000 on that partial rollback. And so that increase becomes a little closer, just under $2 million, about 1.92 million. And that's about a 6.36% increase.
And again, all those numbers are in excess of the 5%
Yes.
projections.
Yes.
Okay. Are there other questions? Okay.
Yep.
Excuse me, Mr. Ashcraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two questions. The first, Mr. Neufeld, on slide 5, third bullet, you talk about the average residential property owner. Could you elaborate a little bit on what that means?
Yeah, we use median sometimes and we use average sometimes. So In the case of the average, it literally is all the houses divided by the number of houses, so in this case, residential property. So that is the absolute average on residential property. That 936 annually, or $78 a month, is that portion that we looked at in those pie charts. It's attributable to the county, so it's not your total tax bill, obviously. And that's just our hypothetical average house. So if that's your exact tax bill, you are completely average, but it's really, you know, it skews for everything from Mission Hills to the smaller houses in other parts of the county.
So approximately what would be the value of a home that pays the average?
I think the average is 312. So that's the next one. The next bullet below that is also average residential property. The 293 to 312 in the parentheses on the next bullet.
Okay, 312, very good.
Yeah.
Okay. Second question, Mr. Chairman, a follow on to your question. I want to make sure I understand. The strategic planning efforts of both parks and libraries, which were completed in 15, set forth projections for the development of both those programs, the enhancements of the park system, the addition of some parks, and the building of some additional libraries. And within that program, there was a built-in 5% increase based upon our best estimates at the time.
Right, and so for planning purposes, that's what everybody's best guess at how much money would be available for those programs in ensuing years.
Okay. And so since then, how close have we been to the actual increases in growth? Have we been pretty much on target, or have we fallen behind or gotten a little bit ahead? Do you have any sense there?
Yeah, in terms of percentage, we've averaged a little over 7% for Park and Rec, and
Each year?
yeah, yes, and so we've been running slightly a little bit over 2% above that. The library has a different taxing district, does not include Olathe, and so for their numbers, they've been averaging closer to 6.75% over the last 3 years. The budget since the 2016 budget, when those plans were funded.
Okay, so they've been running a little bit ahead.
Yes.
A little bit. And,
Yes.
And you're anticipating that next year also?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, at this time, we'll welcome comments. If there's anyone who would like to address the commission on any point of the budget, would invite you to the podium. State your name and address, so we have that for the record. And limit your comments to 3 minutes, and we'll be glad to receive that information.
Good evening. My name is Bill Chappé. I live at 13669 South Locust Street in Olathe. My only comments, I got two items. One is the overall mill levy. You're enjoying a 7% plus increase in valuation. However, your mill levy, even with the projected reduction, is less than 1%. And you use this 5% budget projection. It may be time we pull that back to maybe a little less money to save us taxpayers, even though it's only a $4 a month increase. I have to have this same conversation with the city of Olathe next week, because they're enjoying the windfall of this valuation increase we had last year. The second item, I saw there was a line item in here for the county sheriff to replace, looked to me like about every two-way radio they have in their system at $1.3 million. And I would just like to recommend that they be sure that they use a competitive bidding process to replace those radios, because Motorola is not the only people that make P25 compliant radios. So let's not write the specs to Motorola, and let's see if there's other providers that could save us some money.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Is there somebody else?
My name is Dale Getz. I live at 12108 West 154th Terrace in Overland Park. I would like if somebody could define for me better reserves. When I think of the word reserves, I think of money that's going to be carried forward the next year. It looks like the reserves in this budget are just like a slush fund that when we run over 2% in the parks or 2% in the libraries, we just reach back in this reserve and pay it out. I would hope that in future years, we could come closer to the actual budget numbers and then stay on those budgets. Again, taxpayers don't like to pay taxes. And I see items on here like we're going to put $1.6 million into airports. How many people in Johnson County actually use our 2 airports? How many of those people live in Johnson County? I live adjacent to the executive airport, and the entrances that we've built over there with the stone and the lit Johnson County Executive Airport, that had cost some money. And I don't think it improved runways or anything else. Now, I understand we're doing a paving, is that correct, at the airports? That's what the majority of this money's for. It appears that taxpayers support those 2 airports every year. And if they can't be self-sustaining, do we really need 2? That would be a question I'd ask the
All right.
Chairman. Okay. Thank you.
Appreciate your comment. The airports do not receive any taxpayer dollars. They are an enterprise fund, an enterprise organization. The revenues that are generated by the airport activity support the airport. So there are no general sales or property taxes supporting the airports.
Okay,
Good
from
comment.
page 35 of the budget, does it not say the same thing as property tax right here? I'm sorry, or it says what the airports cost?
Yeah, well, the airports, New Century and Johnson County Executive do not receive any, I think on slide number 3 or 4, the airport's budget is identified, and it is an enterprise fund.
Okay. Can you explain the enterprise fund, just for myself?
Enterprise fund would be that activity which is supported by revenue generated by the airports.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do we know, I'm looking at the letter from the county manager, 17, then 18 and 19, for the projected 19 budget. We had reserves in each one of those. Are there any of those reserve dollars left from 17, 18? Or were they spent then, like I say, more as a slush fund of covering the budget?
Well, let me explain the reserve funds in this manner. Is slide number 4, was that the reserves? Yes. You'll notice that there are general fund reserves identified, and I think the general fund reserves for those activities, those departments, all of those departments are required to maintain a certain level of reserve. In some cases, some departments, let's say mental health, public health, those departments are dependent upon state reimbursements in large part.
Understand.
So if the state doesn't reimburse or doesn't do it on a timely basis, they need those reserves. Then you have reserves for the general fund, which support our AAA ratings on all of the debt that we issue. And that reserve amount is determined in cooperation with the bond rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's. And we're able to maintain that AAA rating. We just sold last week $240 million of bonds for the wastewater plant that I mentioned and the voting machines. And on a 22-year bond, we were able to only have to pay 3.3% interest. So that's the benefit of that kind of reserve. And then some of the other reserves are for stormwater, which is a designated tax, and other designated taxes. So Those are designated reserves that are not available for expenditure outside of those areas.
Okay, so that money's in the bank somewhere.
Pardon?
That money's in the bank somewhere.
That money's in the bank. For instance, stormwater, a city might ask for X dollars to do a stormwater project, and then for some reason, they may not be able to complete it. So that money goes back into the reserve balance to be used next year or the next funding cycle for that specific kind of activity.
I appreciate your response.
Okay.
I think, in my opinion, trying to communicate to the average taxpayer a little better than what we do at a public hearing so that they can take a look, as I have, where you've put away 100 and then 200 and then another 200 million, and I'm thinking that money's going to be in the bank. Well, if you add all those up year after year, you're looking at almost our whole operating budget for 2/3 of a year.
Yeah. Well, I would say those reserves that are there to support the city's AAA rating bonds, those reserves don't change that much. In fact, they might go up. Scott, remind me, our policy is to maintain 20 to 25% general fund reserves, 20 to 25% of our operating budget. And that's a ratio that's been accepted by the rating agencies.
Okay, my time's expired. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Someone else? All right, if there's no one else to be heard, then the public hearing is closed. Thank you all for being present this evening, and would invite you to our August 9th meeting, and final decisions will be made by the Board of County Commissioners. Thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.